Particles in Houdini can be pretty easy to set up and get some cool results, but they can be truly difficult to master. We'll start off simple with all of the basic stuff, but then we are going to step a little bit outside of what I would call beginner level with some of the lessons. So I don't want to just tell you what buttons to press or sliders to adjust to get pretty effects. I want you to understand the fundamental concepts of how particle effects work. Over the years in my professional career, I had to make dozens, if not hundreds of particle shots, and these techniques I'm about to show you I applied in almost all of the shots. They will also carry over to other types of simulations like vellum, RBDs, flip, basically anything that deals with points. So my goal with this course is to set you up for long-term success so that no matter what particle effects you want to create, you can apply these lessons. I hope you will find this course useful, and let's get started. Let's dive in and let's get started. I'll create a geometry container and let's step inside. Now, really all particle effects and all effects in general start with a source, and it's usually a geometry source for particles. So let's drop down a simple sphere. And let's say that we want to spawn particles from this sphere. So from here, all we have to do is drop down a pop network. So let's place this here and we'll plug the sphere into the first input of this popnet. And now if I preview the result, we can see we have some points spawning. So if I play the simulation, we just have some particles spawning and they're just chilling, they're not doing anything. So let's make them do something. We have a few settings on this node over here and we'll cover this in a second, but the way we modify how our particles behave is by stepping inside this DOM network. So let's double click to step inside. And here's the actual solver. So here's the pop solver. And we have some other objects as well. We have the pop object and the pop source. So we'll take a look at these more in depth in a second. But first, let's make our particles do something. So if I press tab and type pop, we can see there's really a lot of stuff for us to do. And one of the more common ones that we'll usually use is going to be the pop force. So let's drop down a pop force. And we have this merge node here that says wire pops into here. So all we have to do is place this inside our merge node, and if I reset the simulation, still nothing happens because we have to set some settings here. So let's just make our particles move up for now, and so this force option here, I'll just give this a direction. If I set this to 0, 1 and 0, this means that our particles should be moving up. So if I press play now, we see something finally happening with our particles. We have some pre-built options here for the noise. So if I increase the amplitude, let's just set this to a value of 1. And if I reset the simulation and press play, now this is starting to look more like the classical particle simulation. In fact, from here, we can just start layering some of these pop nodes, and pop stands for particles operator. So whenever we're dealing with points or particles, you want to use one of these pop nodes. So let's take a look at the pop color. Let's type here pop color and we'll just plug this here. Now we have some colors, and this is just a constant color. As we can see, we can change this. I can make this red, but really what you will usually do is map this to one of the attributes that are built in with the particles. So if I set this type here to a ramp, and this by default is going to grab our normalized age attribute. So this is why this is an age, and we'll just set this now to map to our age. And age is one of the attributes that come with particles. We'll take a deeper look into this a bit later. But what this essentially means now is that when our particles are being born, they start with an age of 0, and over the duration of 1 second, they will fade to this white value here. So when I press play now, they start off black and slowly ramp up to white. And maybe we can increase this span a little bit. So let's maybe map this over a range of 4 seconds in age. And we can also choose maybe one of these other presets here, just so it's more obvious. Let's use black body and let's reverse the order of these colors. So let's maybe just set this to 3 for range. So now we can see we are starting to get something that actually looks pretty cool. And I'll also press D on my keyboard, and I want to go to the background tab here, and I'll change the background here to dark just so we can see this better. And also I'll make this window larger, and I'll close off these windows here, and And in this window, if I press P, I'll just bring back my parameters. So it's just easier for me to work this way. Again, if I select a node here, we'll just show the parameters over here to the right. Now, currently our particles are really lasting forever. So we can remove them once they reach a certain age. So if I go in the pop source here in the birth tab, we can set their life to be a certain value. So we can maybe make them last only to a value of 2.5. So now 2.5 seconds after they're being born, they will die off. So if I play the simulation now, they should die off a bit quicker. And we can also add some variance to this. So if I set the life variance to 0.5, now the particles will last from maybe 2 seconds to 3 seconds. So if I play the simulation now, we should see more of an organic kind of decay on the particles. So this is a lot more natural than having all of the particles die at the same time. So you usually want to add some variance here. And we'll get more to all of these in a second, but we can see with just a couple of nodes, we already start to have something that looks pretty decent and pretty cool. And this was pretty simple, right? This was pretty easy. We just had a couple of nodes, and you can imagine that if we just keep stacking a few more nodes, we can get something pretty complex, and it's pretty easy to do, right? So by now you're probably thinking to yourself that this doesn't look so bad. I can probably learn this in a couple of days, a week at most. But unfortunately, it's not that simple. And if you've seen other tutorials, this way of working, stacking nodes on top of each other, is what you've probably seen and what you're used to. And it's probably what the people at Side Effects wants us to do. That's why they have this merge node over here that says wire pops into here. This stacking is what they want us to do. And in fact, let's just further illustrate this. I can add let's do a pop drag and just add this over here, and I can increase the air resistance. So this is useful when you have fast moving simulations that you want to slow down over time. So if I play the simulation now, they're gonna start off rather fast, but then they're gonna slow down over time. So this is what this air resistance will do for us. And this is just to further illustrate that we can just keep adding and stacking nodes on top of each other until we get what we want. But the reason that I don't like working this way is because this doesn't give you the ultimate control over the particles. You can get pretty good results and you can get pretty far working this way, and there are cases when you will have to work this way, but this at its core is extremely limiting, and we are in Houdini precisely to remove those limits. Doing it this way, you're gonna keep running into walls over and over again. And what I want to show you is going to be a little bit more complex, but this is how you will win in the long game. So this is where the geometry VOP node comes into play. This geometry VOP node is where all of the magic happens, and this is what trumps all of the other nodes. So I will just connect this below my pop source like so, and I will hold down Y and disconnect all of my other pop forces, and I'll just leave them here to the side. And as a side note, you can also connect nodes by merging them like this. So this is what we did originally. We are stacking them horizontally inside a merge node, but you can also just simply plug them in the chain vertically like so. I prefer working this vertical way because it kind of mimics the SOP workflow, but this will be just your preference. This geometry VOP node, we can also merge this here as well, but like I said, I just like working vertically like so. Anyway, if you understand how this geometry VOP node works, you can truly unlock the power of particles. And everything I'm about to show you will translate to the other simulations as well, so if you're doing fluids or rigids, everything here will apply to those other simulations as well. So let's just focus up for a second and we'll step inside. And really this geometry VOP is simply the attribute VOP from the SOP level. So it's going to be important to know how the attribute VOP works. And if you haven't watched it already, I will recommend my Intro to VOPs course before watching this next part that I'm about to show you. So let's start with something simple, and let's just mimic the force node that we had earlier and just simply make our particles move up. So if I replay the simulation now, nothing happens. We are just spawning particles because we disconnected all of the other nodes. All right, so let's step inside and we have a force output over here. So this is the inputs and these are going to be the outputs. So we want to add a simple vector to the force output here that makes our particles move up. So we can just drop down a constant value. Let's set this to a 3 float because we want a vector. I'll plug this in my force and I'll use the same vector I used earlier, which is 0, 1, and 0. So if I reset the simulation and I press play, we have the exact same thing that we had earlier. So nothing special yet. The difference here is that I can plug this inside the velocity now. So if I want, I can update the velocity instead of the force. So when I do this and I reset the simulation and press play, now the particles move at a constant speed, so we no longer have this acceleration thing happening as we do with our force. So if I plug this back in our force, we can see our particles start off slow, almost at a speed of 0, and then they ramp up and settle at a given value here. So we can see this ramp up in speed happening. So right away we run into this big problem where we can't really control this acceleration. If we want our particles to accelerate faster, we could increase this vector here. So if I set, let's say I want to make this 5 times faster, I can set this to 0, 5, and 0. So now this vector that points up will have a 5 times bigger magnitude. So if I reset the simulation now, we can see that the particles accelerate faster, but obviously now we are also carrying this vector throughout the entire simulation, whereas I only wanted to affect the acceleration part. So I wanted them to start off fast and then settle at a lower speed. So this is super hard and really annoying to control with using this force method. And this is the main problem that we have and why people struggle with particles. The people at Houdini that made all of these nodes, that made all of the pop forces, drag, all of these, if I type here pop, we have really a lot of these. So when they made those nodes, they assume that we want to work with this force output for all simulations. And they are correct in a sense that the force is meant to imitate how stuff behaves in real life. So it's more physically accurate. The problem is that when the director comes to you and says that, hey, we have this character that charges up energy and we have particles that swirl around the hand, there's nothing physically accurate about that. So with all of these nodes, we are forced to use the force. But a lot of times, I just want particles to behave exactly like how I tell them. So let's look into some more examples. And with these examples, we'll also explore more of the operations that we can do inside the geometry VOP. And hopefully, as you see these examples, you will get a better idea on why the geometry VOP is really the better way to work when it comes to particles. If you want to learn how to use particles in real-world projects, you can check out my courses on voxite.com. These are in-depth courses based on projects I worked on for League of Legends, Valorant, and many other brands. So let's start with a pretty simple example, and let's say that instead of having these particles move just straight up, let's make them go towards an end goal. So I'll press U to step back outside at the sub level, and here next to my sphere I can just drop down and add a node, and I'll hit this plus to create a simple point. We have a point here in the middle of our scene, and also in our display material icon here I will right click this and I'll switch the display here to points. So now it's just a little bit bigger. Maybe I can also press D on my keyboard and go to geometry settings, and I'll just increase the point size so we can see this better in our viewport. So I can press enter while having this add node selected, and I can just drag this point up in space, and let's say that I want my particles to reach this point. Let's also drop down a null from here, and I'll just rename this to goal. So we keep things nice and organized. And this is what we'll actually use to reference later in our geometry VOP. And now to make our particles go to this point, we have to create this direction vector. And let's maybe just preview our sphere as well. I'll press E on my sphere and select the goal. So we have this display, this ghosted display on our sphere. I'll just do a quick screen grab of this and I'll step over in Photoshop. So let's say we have a particle that's spawning on our sphere, maybe over here, and we need this particle to reach our end goal over here. And we know from Intro to VOPs that if we subtract this position from our own position, we will get a vector that points from our particle to our end goal. Now, if we just do this subtraction, this vector will be quite big, so we will want to normalize this, so it's a unit length of 1. So now no matter where our particle will end up, this vector will have the same unit length, so we will have nice and consistent speed. Now back in Houdini, let's step inside our PopNet, so we'll go over here. Inside this geometry VOP, we can grab the position of our particles from this P over here, but we need a way to reference the position of our end goal point from the SOP level inside this geometry VOP. And this is where the geometry VOP here in the DOPNet is a little bit different than the attribute VOP in the SOP context. So if I go up and I drop down an attribute VOP, which we are familiar with from Intro to VOPs, I can plug the sphere here inside this first input for the attribute VOP, and now I can do all kinds of operations. We will access all of our points, and our op input 1, 2, 3, and 4 will correspond to these inputs here at the SOP level. But when we are inside the geometry VOP, we don't have any of these 4 outputs, but if I step inside, we do have this op input 1, 2, 3, and 4 here either way. And the way we can use these when it comes to the geometry VOP is if we go up, we can go to the inputs tab, and this is where we can specify what geometry we can use to then later access from all of these op input parameters here. So all we have to do is, let's say that we want input 1 over here to point to our goal geometry. We can just go up and I will grab, let's actually get rid of this attribute VOP. We will grab this null with our goal. I will press Ctrl C. I'll step back inside the PopNet, and in this geometry VOP in the inputs tab, let's say I want to access this from op input 1. I will set this to reference a SOP geometry, and I can just paste the path to our goal here. So all I did here was Ctrl V, and this just grabs the path to our null. Okay, so let's go back inside, and now from inside our geometry VOP, from op input 1, we can reference the geometry. So from our goal geometry, we want to import a position attribute. So for this, we can use the import point attribute node. And by default, this will specify our attribute P, which is the position, which is what we want. The signature is vector 3, which is what we want. And we also have to specify the point number. Now, because we only have one point in our geometry, this will mean that the index value will be 0. So all we have to do here is we can middle mouse click on this ptnum. I will promote this to a constant. And by default, this will give me a constant of 0, which is exactly what we want. So all of this, what it's doing is we're just grabbing the position from our goal point. And now from here, like we mentioned in this graph, we have to subtract the positions. So back inside Houdini, we can subtract this position from our end goal. Let's use a subtract, and we'll subtract our own position. Now let's go ahead and disconnect this. We no longer need this. So from this subtraction, we get our direction vector, and we want to normalize this to have a nice constant length. And we can just do a normalize from here. And let's plug this into the force, and let's see what happens. Let's also preview this now. I will right click this icon and choose pixels, and let's press play. and we can see the particles are slowly starting to move towards our goal point. And as they increase in their speed, let's play for a few more frames, we can see they start to overshoot and they step outside of the goal area. And this will be more apparent if I go back up and I increase their life expectancy. Let's maybe set this to a value of 10 and let's reset and play. So we can see clearly now that they overshoot, and as they get further away from our goal, they start to slow down, and after they slow down, they're allowed to come further back to the end goal. So this is really hard and really kind of annoying to control, and maybe I can illustrate this better if we animate this goal point. So let's go back up to the SOP level, and before our null, we can just do a transform over here on our point. Let's go ahead and I'll just add a keyframe for the translation values. I'll hold down Alt and left click to add a keyframe here, and I'll just go maybe to the end of our timeline, frame 240, and let's press enter in the viewport here, and I'll just move this over to the side. All right, and this will automatically add a keyframe for us, and now we can see we have, let's maybe turn this back to point display. Now we can see that our goal is traveling across our scene. So let's go back to pixel display, and now this will be more obvious what happens when we update our force. So if I press play now, let's see. We see that over here, right where our particles are converging, this is where currently our goal point is. And we can see that as the particles overshoot, they again start to slow down and they will start to try to go back to the end goal. So we can see this clearly now. Okay, so this is the result that it's happening. And obviously this is not what we want. We just want the particles to go to our end goal point. So what we can do is we can just step inside here, and if we update the velocity instead, we should now get the expected result. So we have a little knot thing happening here. Now we can we'll deal with this in a second, but we can see now that our particles are just going towards that goal, and they're also following the updated position of this goal. So this is exactly what we would expect to happen. All right, we can see that this is a lot more controllable now. And if I want this to go faster, I can just scale this vector up. So after this normalize, I can do a multiply constant. And if I want the particles to go twice as fast, I can just set this multiplier to a value of 2. All right, and now again, they're moving fast, but they're stopping right around the goal point. Whereas if I use the force here, and especially now that they're going twice as fast, this will be even more chaotic. So they're overshooting even more now, and they're having a hard time going back to the end goal. Now, this is a pretty cool effect as well, and you might need to do this sometime, but a lot of the time what we need is just exactly what we expect. We want the particles to move to a specific place in a specific way at a specific speed. And one simple way to fix this knot thing happening here is we can simply kill the particles off before they reach the end goal. So we can see that maybe at frame 30 they reach their end goal, which means that if we set their life, if I go up and go back in my pop source, if I set their life to maybe 1.2 seconds, which is roughly 30 frames. So again, 24 frames will mean that we have a life expectancy of 1. So I'm just increasing this value a little bit to maybe 1.2. Let's remove the variance, or let's maybe just use a low variance 0.1. And if I reset, we see now that they get removed basically based on their age when they reach this point. So this is one way to fix this. There's a million ways to fix this. Don't worry about this. For now, it's not really the point I'm trying to make. The point is to illustrate the differences between updating velocity and force. And now the cool thing about using the geometry VOP also is that we can build on top of what we have. So let's maybe make some room here. And instead of just adding things here, what I like to do usually to keep things a little bit more organized is I can grab this input node over here, and I can hold down Alt and drag this over to duplicate this, and I can do further things from here. So it's going to be the same as if I were to use this same one, but we can get a little bit messy with the wiring. So I like to make a new copy for this. Let's add some noise to the simulation, and we can use a curl noise with a 4D signature, which will give us the best results. So from our position, let's do a vector to vector 4, and I'll plug the time in the second input here. Now all this vector 4 business means that it's essentially just going to animate the noise. So this is what the fourth component stands for in a vector to vector 4 when it comes to noise. So don't really worry about this for now. Let's just do a curl noise from here, and let's set the noise type. Let's use analytic fast simplex noise, which I found gives the best results. And now what we can do is simply add this. Let's maybe just get rid of this multiply constant so we don't have the particles move as fast. So all we have to do now is just add our noise on our original direction. So from here, we'll do an add, and the result of this noise, let's just plug this here. And if I play this now, we can see instant magic. And this is the secret right here. We get the direction what we want, we add some noise on top, and we can have any type of movement. And when we add our noises and we control the particles further, we can really get super cool looking magical effects especially, and we will have complete control over what happens during our entire simulation. And we can see that this is already looking pretty cool. And for example, we could animate our goal point to move in specific directions, and these particles would follow that goal precisely. Maybe I can make the particles last a little bit longer. Let's maybe try a value of 2. All right, so it's moving towards the end goal, and everything's starting to look pretty cool. And maybe I can just bring back my pop color. I can place this over here. All right, so we can see really cool effects. Now again, if I were to use the force instead with this noise on top, if I plug this inside the force, we'll have an even harder time controlling the effect. Let's maybe make the particles last longer. I'll set the life back to a value of 10. And if I play the simulation now, and let's actually remove the pop color for now, we can disable or rather bypass any node if we press Q. So I'll just turn off this pop color for now and reset the timeline, and we can see we have an even harder time controlling our particles. This noise creates all kinds of acceleration problems for us, and it's really starting to look like a mess. And even if I were to decrease the amplitude here to maybe a lower value of 0.3, this might help us fix the things a little bit, but still it's going to not give us the results that we want. So again, we want to use velocity instead, and this is the result. So I can increase the amplitude even further, and we can see that it's still doing a pretty good job trying to match the position of our goal point. Let's set this back to 1. So this here is really just scratching the surface, and just as an example, let's say that maybe we want to control this amplitude, so the strength of our curl noise based on our age. So if I grab the age and plug this inside the amplitude, now this will mean that when our particles spawn, they will have no strength on the noise, and over the period as they age, they will start to increase the amplitude. So if I play the simulation now, we see that they start with no noise, and after a while they start to introduce this noise inside the simulation. Now this is kind of getting out of hand after a few seconds. So to further control this, we can remap the age value. So I will just grab this wire that goes from the age to the amplitude, and I will do a fit range over here. And now we can say that when our age has a value of 0 up until it has a value of 1, I want the amplitude to go from 0 to 1. So right away with the default settings, this will give us more controllable results, because now the amplitude is not allowed to go further this value of 1. So if I want, I can clamp this strength, of the curl noise to maybe 0.5, so it's not as strong, all right? Or I can even reverse this effect and say that I want amplitude when they start right as they spawn, and then as they age, let's decrease this strength. So I can reverse the destination mean and max here. I can set this to 1 and 0. So if I play now, they start off with a high strength in the curl noise, and then they will no longer receive this curl noise as they age. So this is also helping us to control the simulation a lot more. And for example, I can maybe decrease how fast this amplitude decays. So I can reduce the source max here, and only right as they spawn they will get this strength, and then very quickly no longer receive any strength of the noise. So maybe I can now increase the destination mean. So I can set this to a value of 3. And I can spend a lot of time here, and really hopefully this gives you an idea on the amount of control that we have. And I just want to show you one more thing with this age. If I reset the values, so let's go from 0 to 1 to 0 and 1, I can use a ramp after the fit. So let's drop down a ramp parameter. I'll set this to a spline ramp. And the way we can change this is at the top level, so I'll press U to go up one level, and we have to change this over here. So if I expand this window, I can reset the ramp if I hold down Control and middle mouse click on where it says ramp over here. And this default ramp will go from 0 to 1, so we'll have the same result we had in the first place. But now, for example, let's say that when our particles have an age of 0.3, I want the maximum strength, and when they have an age value of 1, they have a strength of 0. So now somewhere in between after they spawn and when they reach their goal point, this is where we will apply the strength, okay? So this is again to illustrate the amount of control that we have. And also let's step back inside. I'll get rid of this connection here for our curl noise. I'll just leave this as an amplitude of 1. We can also use this age thing here. Let's get rid of the ramp. And from this fit, from our age, let's multiply our original direction. So if I use a multiply here, I can plug our fit result, and we'll leave the fit as the default values. So now if I press play, let's actually maybe just disconnect the curl noise for now and just focus on the direction strength. If I press play, we can see we have kind of the same result that we had with the force, where we create this acceleration for the particles to ramp up in speed over time using our age. So we get this smooth, nice transition for our particles as they start to spawn, and we don't have to worry about that overshooting nightmare that we have with the force. So there's really, sky is the limit here. There's really a lot of things that we can do. And for example, if I were to go up and I wanted to recreate this effect with pop nodes, we can use, I'll disable the geometry VOP again with Q. Let's use a pop attract. So what we did with our geometry VOP really is just recreating this pop attract. Let's place this here, and with this node selected I can press enter in the viewport, and I can just set an end goal. Let's maybe just use the same kind of position that we had earlier. So if I reset the simulation, we had the exact same thing that we had earlier with our force. As we can see, now the particles over here will start to go back to reach our end goal. But again, this is the problem, that we don't have the option to update the velocity instead. And also the strength of the geometry VOP is that we can add the noises and we can add on top of what we have without relying on the pre-built nodes. So for example, here, if I wanted to add some turbulence as well, we would have to use a different node. So we have to use a pop force to combine this here with our pop attract, and I can increase the amplitude. All right, so I want to introduce some noise, but again, this will just mess up my entire simulation. Now, usually with a lot of these pop forces, you have to use the pop drag as well. So we have the pop drag from earlier over here, and I can place this here. So this is a way to slow down the system over time, and this is specifically to avoid kind of this overshooting problem. So if I play the simulation now, let's maybe go to the drag settings. Let's leave this air resistance to the default value of 1. So let's press play, and let's maybe just disable the pop force so we can concentrate only on what the pop attract is doing. We can see now that with the pop drag, we no longer have this kind of overshooting, but we still end up with kind of a weird result, to be honest. So this is just kind of a weird and hard way of working, and we can see how much easier and clearer it is when we are using the geometry VOP and we update the velocity. But if we wanted to, we can still use the geometry VOP and update the force instead, and we will still have a lot more control than relying on what the guys at Houdini built up for us, because these settings here are all limited. Now, their dirty secret is that if I right click and choose allow editing of contents, I can step inside and see how they build this node. And if I step inside any of these nodes, we can see that really what's driving this is this geometry VOB node, all right, over here. So if I step inside, this is everything that's inside the pop attract. Now, there's really a lot of different tabs here because all of these correspond. If I go up a couple of levels, all of these parameters here that are exposed for us correspond to all of these tabs. So this is why it's kind of looking like a mess, but you can still go inside any of these pop nodes and you can see exactly how they build them with the geometry VOP. So if I go up and I inspect the pop force, we can click, right click, allow editing of contents, step inside, and here we have it. It's a geometry VOP. And if I step inside, we can see that at the base of it is really just a curl noise. So the same thing that we did earlier. But we can see that this is exporting back to the force attribute. So this is the problem with all of these nodes, and really they could have solved all of this if they just made a switch export for us to make us choose whether we want to export to the force output or the velocity output. I don't know why they didn't do this. It would be really easy to set up, but regardless, in the long game, you want to master the geometry VOP yourself so you can build whatever kind of logic you want. So this is the first example that I wanted to show, and I want to show you just one more example. Because this is such an important topic, I really want to help you solidify these core concepts. For our second example, let's do a classic tornado simulation. So I'll go ahead and let's get rid of this geometry VOP. I'll just disconnect this and place it over to the side. And for a tornado simulation, we might need to change the geometry source. So I'll go up, and instead of a sphere, let's drop down a torus and let's plug this here. And maybe for my torus, let's look at our torus. I'll just increase the first radius value here. Let's just make this bigger and maybe decrease the second value so it's kind of thin. And I might want to just increase the resolution for the subdivisions. This will be fine. Let's go back inside. So currently we are not doing anything. Let's actually get rid of this pop color as well. And let's go to our pop source. I should have done this from the beginning. Let's just disable the guide geometry so we just see our points. All right, so if I press play, nothing happens, or our points just spawn. And now if we want to do a tornado effect with our pop forces nodes, we can use a pop axis force. Let's drop this here, and if I press play, nothing happens, and this is already a problem that's really annoying. This pop force works with this radius that we have inside here, and we have to increase our radius. And now we can see if I press play, our particles start to spin and they're kind of going crazy and they're escaping. So now in order to compensate for this shooting out of the particles, we have to go, I believe, let's go in our speed, and there is a suction speed option here. So I have to increase this, and now if I press play, this will be a force that's dragging, that's pulling the particles closer inside. So maybe I can reduce this. And I also want to add a lift speed, which will make our particles raise. Let's maybe use a value of 0.5 for our lift. And let's press play. So we are kind of starting to get what we want. Now again we have to adjust the radius. So we'll go in the shape tab and we'll just increase the height. Maybe if I press enter, I believe we can also use these handles here. So we are kind of guessing the height of our tornado. Let's take a look at our simulation now. It's kind of starting to look how it is, but we can see that the particles are pulling closer at the beginning and then they are again escaping. So really there's a lot of problems here, but if I were to spend a couple of extra seconds on this, I might want to add a pop drag. So usually with all of these axes, with all of these force nodes, we want to add drag. So right away, we should have a better result. All right, this kind of works. Let's also just do turbulence. So let's add a pop force and let's increase the amplitude and also introduce some noise, and maybe I'll just increase the lift speed. Let's set this to 1 so they're rising faster, and maybe I'll decrease the amplitude of the pop force. So I don't really want to spend a lot of time here, but this is to illustrate that you can get a pretty decent result. We can see that this is actually looking like a pretty good simulation for the most part. This can be a good base for a tornado. So this is pretty cool, but again, we don't have the control that we want. So thanks, but no thanks. We're just gonna go ahead and use the geometry VOP. We'll start with a fresh one. So if I reset, we just have our particle spawning. So we'll use the same concepts from the first example and we'll apply it here, meaning that we'll generate a direction vector first that will create the general direction of our particles, and then we'll just add some noise on top. Now, I'll just do a quick screen grab of this and step over in Photoshop for a sec. We need our particles to go in sort of like this direction, which is also spinning and going up at the same time. So we need to create a vector that spins. So it's going in this direction like so. And then we can combine this, we can add on top of this vector, if we just add a simple vector that points straight up like so, we get the combination between these two vectors that end up in a result that looks something like this. So this is how we will get this vector again that's also spinning and going up at the same time. Now for our green vector here, this vector that points straight up, this will be just a simple constant of 0, 1, and 0. It's this other vector that's spinning around, which we can't really just set directly. So this is the one that's a little bit trickier to get. Now, we already solved this problem in the Intro to VOP series, but I'll just explain this again. In order to get this vector, so if we have a point that's over here and we need this to spin around the origin of our scene, so this is the vector that we want to get. We can use a cross product to get this vector, and a cross product is just a vector that's perpendicular to the plane that other two vectors create. So if we imagine the perpendicular plane that this vector falls onto, we can kind of draw this over here so it looks something like this. All right, so this is this imaginary plane that's perpendicular to our vector. And now these will be the vectors that we need to get and create a cross product between them so we can get our vector. All right. Now we can see that one of these is actually just a simple up vector. Okay, so again, this is just the vector that points straight up. So this is going to be 0, 1, and 0. And this other vector over here, we can get if we just subtract the position of our point with the center of our scene, which is 0, 0, 0. So we'll just grab our position and we'll subtract this value and we'll get this vector, and then this vector we already know, 0, 1, and 0. So now we can create a cross product between these and we will get this vector. So let's see how this looks in VOPs. We'll step inside our geometry VOP, and so again we'll need to grab the center here. Let's simply do a constant and we'll set this to be a 3 float. and we'll just leave this at 0, 0, 0. So it's going to be this origin over here. So now we'll grab the position of each point. Let's go ahead and let's actually subtract from our center. We'll do a subtract and we'll subtract the position of our particle. So a point and a particle is the same thing in Houdini. Now, we'll also have to normalize this, and usually when we are doing cross products, we want to work with normalized vectors. So from the subtract, we'll do a normalize, and from here, we'll do a cross product. So let's drop down a cross product, and we can either plug a value directly as the second vector here, or we can just set it ourselves directly inside the cross product node parameters here. And we can already see that this is set to the 0, 1, and 0 vector, which again is this one that we need that points up. So now from here, from our cross product, I can just plug this result in our V, and we should see our particles start to spin, and this is great. So now from here, all we have to do is simply add on top of this vector. So we'll drop down an add, we'll drop down a constant, and we'll use the same vector. Let's set this to 3 float, and we also want to add this 0, 1, 0 vector that points up, and we'll plug this here. So now if we play, our particles are spinning and moving up at the same time. So the cool thing here is now that if I want the particles to not move up as fast, I can just decrease the value of this vector here. So this constant, let's set this to 0.5. So now they're moving up twice as slow. And we can also control the spinning. So after this cross product, if I multiply this length of the vector, we can simply do a multiply constant. And if I want to move them, if I want them to spin twice as fast, I'll just increase the multiplier to a value of 2. So now they're spinning twice as fast, and we can exactly control what we want. So for example, now we can maybe instead of this multiply constant, I can drop down a multiply. And let's say that maybe we want our particles to spin faster as they age. So again, we can reference our age attribute. I just created the duplicate of this. So we can plug the age attribute in our multiply, and now we can see that as they start to age, they will increase their spinning more and more. So we can do all of the stuff that I showed you in the first example, but let's for now just go ahead and add our noise. In fact, for this, I can just go up and let's go inside our first example, and I'll just grab this noise setup because we already made this. So this will be the curl noise. I'll just Control C, so I can just copy this, and I will paste this inside my new geometry VOP network. And I will just simply add this to our vector, and let's take a look. Now that we are using a different scale, we might want to decrease the frequency of this. Usually what I like to do is I use one set of noise for big swirls. So let's maybe decrease this and also decrease the amplitude. So sometimes I like to use one curl noise for big swirls, and then I can just simply duplicate this. And for this one, I can increase the frequency and just decrease the amplitude. So this will give me finer details. So if I press play now, we start to layer some of these noises and we can get really complex effects. And now again, at any point, we can map any of these values or our vectors to our age. So we can also grab our position, for example, and we can do a vector to float. So we can split up this vector. And if we grab our second value here, this will be the Y component of our position. So we can say that whenever a particle's position is higher than maybe a value of 2, so it's maybe somewhere around here, we can make it do different stuff. So we can maybe stop it, or we can increase the speed, or whatever else we want to do. We have the option to do this. We can also introduce that suction thing we have in our force. So when we do our subtraction here and normalize this vector, again, if we look at this, is going to be this vector here that points from our origin. So we can use this. If I just plug this in our add, let's take a look. All right, now we can see we also have this suction going on, and we can now simply scale this. We can do a multiply constant, and we can scale this back. so it's not as harsh. All right, maybe increase this even more. And again, we can scale this with age, we can scale this with whatever, and we really have a lot more control this way. Now, I know that I'm really throwing a lot of stuff at you. I'm probably stepping outside of the beginner zone, but I really don't think there's any point in me bullshitting you into using any of these pop nodes when I never use them in my professional work anyway. In fact, the pop axis force node I probably never used precisely because it's so hard to control and I couldn't get it to work the way that I want. So if all of this didn't make a lot of sense to you, I will encourage you to maybe watch this a couple more times and try this setup yourself. You can also try to draw the vectors on paper or whatever yourself to try to see how you could create different vectors. And I really encourage you to experiment. So try out different values. For example, try out if you were to use inside this cross product, maybe you can use a value of 0 or rather 1, 0 and 0 and see what kind of result you get. You can see we are starting to get some really cool, interesting effects. So let's maybe also see 0, 0 and 1 because now I'm curious what happens. Okay, so it's just going in the other direction. But you can see that we're getting some really interesting stuff going. So try this out, try to experiment and use VOPs as much as you can. Try to incorporate them in your practice. And like I said earlier, a lot of this will translate to all the other simulations as well. So when you're doing flip or rigids or pyro, all of this stuff will really apply there as well. This essentially just rewires your brain into thinking in Houdini terms. So it takes some practice and effort initially, but this stuff will carry over throughout your entire Houdini journey. All of this is stuff you could have done 10 versions ago in Houdini, and it's stuff you will be able to do 10 versions later in Houdini, no matter how many pop nodes the Houdini guys will add for us. So by now you probably get the point that I'm trying to make. This is how I prefer to control particles. We might get into more examples later, and I will also probably want to show you some examples when you do want to use some of these pop nodes. So these are not useless by any means. Like I said, they still show up in a lot of cases. And we'll take a look at them later, but for now I want to focus in the next lesson on this pop source and sourcing particles in general. So now that we kind of have an idea on how the particles can move, equally as important is how we are sourcing in the particles. So let's talk more about this pop source node over here, and to better explain this, we can change the source geometry. So I'll go up and let's replace this torus. Let's just do a simple grid and I'll plug this here. Let's go to our grid and let's increase the subdivisions here. Let's do 100 by 100. And let's see if this works. All right, so let's go back inside, and in our source tab we have this emission type set to scatter onto surfaces. Now there are some other types which we will get to in a second. Let's focus on this one for now. Now this does exactly what it says. It's each frame, it's looking at our geometry and it's scattering points onto it. So maybe I can set this to a point display, and actually let's just disable the geometry VOP for now and let's make these particles static. So if I go forward in time, we can see each frame we are just simply adding a new set of points on top of the previous set of points that we had, and each frame we get a different seed for our scatter. So we can control the amount of points we scatter through the birth tab. If I increase this, if I add another 0 here, we will scatter 10 times as many points. Now in the source tab we also have, with this mode with scatter onto surfaces, we have an emission attribute option here, so we can define an attribute on our geometry. So if I go up, I can add an attribute on our grid which will specify where we want more points to spawn. So we can use a noise to create this attribute. Let's go ahead and just do an attribute VOP, and there are a lot of noise, or rather nodes that we can add noise to, but let's just get used to the attribute VOP as well at the SOP level, and let's step inside. So let's grab our P and let's do an anti-alias flow noise. And we can preview how this looks if I plug this in our CD. All right, so this will be the pattern. Let's disconnect this color connection and let's export this. Let's create our attribute. We will do a bind export and let's create an attribute called emit, like so. We can give this any name you want. It doesn't have to be emit, but let's just use emit in this case. So now if I go up, I can go in my popnet, and inside the pop source, inside the emission attribute, I can specify to look for this emit attribute. And now we can see where we have higher values on our emit. This is where we will have more points. So if I play the simulation now, let's maybe turn back on our geometry VOP, and let's actually rename this to tornado VOP. All right, so if I press play, now with this additional noise on our source, we will have an even more interesting effect. So let's set this back to pixel display. And now we can see with the noise variation in our source, this is looking a lot more organic and more interesting. Maybe I'll go back in my geometry VOP and inside the cross product over here, let's set this back to 0, 1, and 0. So this is now going straight up. And I might want to just increase the lifting speed here. So with this constant, I'll set this to 0, 1, and 0. So now they just rise a little bit faster. But this is all so we can see our emission a little bit better. All right, so let's go back up. Now, back in our attribute VOP, let's rename this to add noise. Back inside our attribute VOP, let's check our spreadsheet real quick. We can see that our emit attribute has values that go from around -0.4 to a value of +0.4, and it's generally not recommended to have negative values when you are sourcing in most types of simulation as well. So what we can do is let's step inside and let's remap the values of our noise. Let's use a fit range and let's say that our source mean and max, let's do -0.5 to 0.5. And we will just remap these to 0 and 1. All right, so now we have nice clean values that go from 0 and 1. And if I go back to my popnet, we should have the same effect. Or rather, now that we have a lot of values that are closer to 0 but not completely 0, we have a lot of points spawning in a lot of areas. So maybe I can go back in our fit and I can increase the source mean. Let's use -0.3. All right, so we can tighten up the ranges here. Let's use maybe 0.1 or rather -0.1, and let's also reduce the source max. All right, so feel free to play around and experiment with the values, but we can see the results that we get. And also now with our flow noise, we can change the frequency, so I can make this pattern larger. And we can also animate this noise over time, so this will translate to our simulation. So what I can do simply to animate this, we can animate this flow parameter in our flow noise. So if I increase this, we can see how our pattern changes. I can simply plug the time inside the flow value over here. And now if I just look at the result of my source, let's maybe just create a visualizer for this. If I click the information, I can click on this emit attribute and let's turn on visualizer. So here we have the pattern and we can see how this is evolving over time. So maybe this is evolving a little bit too fast. I can simply scale down this time here. So let's do a multiply constant and let's scale this down to maybe 0.25. All right, so now it's 4 times as slow. So this is looking better. And if I go back up, let's leave the visualizer on so we can get some kind of trippy effects. And if I play the simulation now, we are also evolving the noise over time. So we are introducing even more variation and we can see what kind of crazy results we can get. There is another extra option here for our emission. If we go to again back to our pop source, we can turn on scale point count by area, and this sort of acts as a reverse multiplier, meaning that if I reset the timeline, the more I decrease this setting, the more points we will scatter per area, and this will take into account this emit attribute. So it will only spawn more points based on the emit attribute. And if I go back up, we can check, and now we can see very quickly we are adding up. So we are currently at around 3 million points, and now this is starting to look more like a high quality simulation. So let's maybe just go back over here, and I'll actually just disable the scale point count. So you can either decrease this value here in the scale point count by area. Now this only works, I think, if you have this emission attribute, or you can just simply go to the birth tab and you can increase the constant birth rate here to increase the particle count. So the more randomness you add, the generally the better results you will get. Let's disable this visualizer. And particles by nature inherit all of the attributes from our source, and we'll go more in depth about this later, but let's add some noise on our color of our source. So back inside our attribute VOP, one of my favorite noises is the Voronoi noise. So let's drop down a Voronoi noise, and from the seed here we can generate a random value, and let's output a 3D color. All right, let's set this option here to 3D color, and let's plug this into our CD. So this is what we get, and let's just leave this as it is, and let's go to our popnet and let's press play, and this is the result that we get. So really interesting stuff we can do. So this is why sourcing is really important. Now there are some limitations to this option here, scatter onto surfaces. Namely, it's limited to the amount of resolution the geometry has. So if I go up and I go back to my grid, now in this grid I intentionally set the rows and columns to high amount, to 100 by 100. So if I set this to something like 5 by 5, now because we have less points on our geometry, we are going to lose all of the detail in our noises. So we can see that this is how our noise looks, and if I go back to my popnet, we have a completely different result. So we don't have enough points on our geometry to create all of this nice detail for our noise. So again, if I go back here and I have 50 by 50, if I check my attribute VOP, now we have a little bit more resolution, and even more if I were to set this to 200 by 200, we can see in real time how much detail we get with more resolution. But we don't want to be limited with our topology. So what happens is in production, you will often receive a mesh. Let's maybe say that you have a task to emit particles from a shield, and that shield may have large flat surfaces where the modeler didn't set a lot of topology, and then around the edges maybe we have a lot of polygons, so the topology is more condensed. So we are limited in that sense to the topology when we are creating our noises. So in this case, it's better if we simply scatter our own points and we feed those points into the popnet. So I will disconnect this attribute VOP here. Let's go back to our grid, and let's say that we have a really low poly geometry. Let's use 2 by 2, so it's just one polygon. If we do our own scatter, let's drop a scatter here. Let's disable relax iterations, and let's just increase, or maybe let's leave the total count as it is, but I'll disable the max point limit. Now we can use these points directly in our popnet. So if I go to the popnet here, let's set this emission type here. Let's set this to all points. So now we are going to use exactly the points that we are feeding into our popnet. All right, so if I press play now, we see this is the result. And now we are getting this trail kind of effect, and this is because our scatter is no longer randomized per frame. So if I look at what we have, each frame we are in fact just using the same points that we have. So we have to change the seed ourselves on the scatter. So in the scatter here, I will go to the global seed here, and I will just link this to the frame numbers. So we will just add an expression here, $F, like so. So this evaluates to our current frame. We can see we are on frame 11, and on frame 12 we are going to have a different seed, and we can see that each frame we are getting a new set of points. And now if we go back to our popnet and press play, we have the same result that we had earlier with our scatter onto surfaces type. Now here it's best practice, instead of this $F expression, it's better to use $FF expression, and this FF is to account for any substeps that you may have in your simulation. So when you increase the substeps here, and we'll go over this in a second, this will make sure that we are given a different seed for each step that might be in between frames as well. Don't worry too much about this, we'll talk more about this later. But anyway, Anyway, back in our PopNet, we have the same result we had originally, but now what we can do is we can simply add our noise after the scatter. Alright, so if I play the simulation now, we have almost the same thing that we had earlier. So if I play the simulation now, we have the same thing that we had earlier, but we are not limited to our topology. So again, in our grid, we only have one polygon. So it's going to be the same even if we have more topology here. So if I set this back to 100 by 100, we are going to get the same results. So this is now only dependent on our scatter points. Here I can simply increase the force total count. I can set this to 10,000 and now this will be the result. So we have a lot of resolution. And again, in our grid, I can set this to a 2 by 2 or a 5 by 5. It doesn't matter as long as our source looks like this. So these will be our points. We are going to get the same result. So a lot of time what we do in simulations is we just experiment at a lower point count. So I might do my experiments on 1000 until I get the colors and the movement right. And then when I want to make the final high quality resolution, I would just increase the count here to maybe add another 0. So it's 10 times as many points. And then this is the simulation that I would cache. So let's set this back to 1000. Now the problem here with this all points emission is we are no longer having this option to use an emission attribute. So what we can do in this case, we can simply delete the points that have an emit attribute of 0. So after our attribute VOP here, where we create our emit attribute, let's go up and we can simply use a blast node. I will set the group type here to points and I will add a simple expression which will say that if the emit attribute is 0, then go ahead and remove those points. So if I turn this on and off, we can see we get rid of all these points. So now we roughly have the same result that we had earlier when we used an emission attribute. Maybe I can force this more a little bit. Let's increase more, let's scatter more points. And if I go in the attribute VOP here in my fit range, let's just squeeze the source min a little bit more. All right, so now let's just maybe look at our source with our blast. This is what we are sourcing. These are the points. And when we are creating the simulation, it looks something like this. So now we have all of the variation from our noises and we are not dependent on the topology that we are using. So oftentimes this is my preferred method of working, but of course you can still use the scatter onto surfaces type. This works really well with curves a lot of the time, so that's really useful. But again, I prefer the all points usually. And here we have a couple more types that we can look into. Let's set this to all geometry. Now, in order for this to work, let's go up and let's just use the grid as it is. So I'll just simply plug the grid, okay, before the scatter. Let's just disconnect this. So here is our grid. And if we look at the result now, let's press play. We can see this very trippy kind of result, and I will press Shift W to hide the wireframe. And this is the result that we get. So this is actually looking pretty cool, pretty interesting. So what's happening here is that this all geometry setting will bring in the points and bring the primitives along with the points. So usually with the other types of emission types, whether it's all points or scatter onto surfaces, this usually disregards the primitive geometry whether you have it or not. But when it's set to all geometry, this will carry over the curves and the primitives and polygons and really everything on top of the point. So this is the result that we are getting. And what's happening here is that each frame we are spawning a different sheet of polygons. So we are sourcing in grids every frame. If I go frame by frame, let's actually press Shift W to bring back our wireframe view. So if I step forward one frame or a couple of frames, and by the way, I'm using the arrow keys to scroll through frames on my timeline, we can kind of see some spacing between our sheets over here, so between our grids. And this is really what's happening. We can see each frame, we just bring another set of, or rather another grid object into our system. So this is why we have this kind of trippy effect. So this works on curves as well. If I were to go up, let's set the grid, let's go to our grid here. And if I set the connectivity here to columns, we turn all of these into curves basically. So maybe I can just reduce the columns amount. Let's use maybe let's use 25, and this will carry over as well, so the curves to our pop system as well. So if I press play now, we can see that our curves are being advected. It's actually, we are just changing the point's position, but we are just simply bringing the curve primitive along with the points. So this is the result that we have. And again, we are just spawning a lot of curves each frame, but you can get some very interesting results this way. And if I set this back to, let's reset, so I will hold down Control and middle mouse click over here, and let's set the rows here to 50 by 50. Now, if you are using this all geometry type, the topology will be important. So if I don't have enough subdivisions, this will not look like a very cool effect. So it's important to note that again, we are just really operating over the points and bringing the primitives along with them. So we can see that it kind of looks like a cloth simulation, but it's not really anything close to it because we have a lot of intersections. So it won't matter for our points if the primitives are colliding within each other, as opposed to what happens in a real cloth simulation if you use Vellum, for example. So that's just something to keep in mind, but you can still get some pretty cool effects. Now, if we just want to use one single grid, so one single sheet of polygons here, we can go inside our pop source, and in the birth tab, so this is all geometry, in the birth tab we have this impulse activation option. So this, if it's 1, it's going to keep bringing in the geometry, and if this is 0, it's not going to use the geometry. So what we can do is we can set this to 1, and we can simply animate this value. So I can hold down Alt and left click to add a keyframe. I can move forward 1 frame. So on frame 2, I will set this value to 0. So now we only have a geometry source for the first frame, and if I simulate, if I press play, we only have one sheet of this polygon grid. And usually people prefer to use an expression here, so I will Control Shift click on the value. Let's set this back to 1, and we can use an expression. We can set a condition here which we can evaluate to true or false, so 1 or 0, and we can say that let's say $f equals 1. So this means that if our current frame is 1, this will be true, so it's going to be 1, and the next frame, when we have frame 2 and further, our condition will no longer be true, so it will be 0. So this now evaluates to 0, and it will be 1, as we can see here, only when we are on frame 1. If I move forward 1 frame, this will be 0, and the other frames as well. So again, we have the same result, but we just use an expression here. So people usually prefer to use expression in this impulse activation option. We can also say maybe that if we want to spawn grids for the first 10 frames, instead of this condition here, let's say that if the frame, so $f less than or equal to 10, all right, this will evaluate true for the first 10 frames. So if I press play, we are spawning 10 sets of grids, and then we are no longer spawning them. So again, this is just spawning them for the first 10 frames. So this is also quite common that you will see people using. Now we can affect how our sourcing operations behave in this birth tab with the impulse activation here, or let's Control Shift click and set this back to 1. We can affect our sourcing at the SOP level. So if I go up, let's maybe use points instead. Let's turn this back to points. So I will reconnect my scatter, and let's go inside here. And this will give us the same effect if we set this, or rather if we leave it to all geometry. So if I press play, this will work, but let's just use all points instead. Again, it's the same thing because we don't have primitives here. The all geometry will be the same. So let's just actually leave this as all geometry. Now, if I want, I can delete points over time, and this will affect our sourcing. So if I go up at the SOP level, after our blast node, let's do another attribute VOP, and let's say, let's rename this to fade source. We can step inside, and using a random value, we can start removing some of the points. So from our ptnum, let's use this as a seed inside a random function. And if I do a compare from here, I can say if this is greater than a given value, let's go ahead and remove those points. So I can preview how this looks if I just plug this in the CD, we can see that as I start to increase this value, all of our points start to turn black. So they're not really disappearing, it's just that they're turning black. We still have them, all right? So we can use this value to remove points. So instead of plugging this inside the CD, we can use this inside an if block. So again, this is like an if statement. We are just using this basically as a condition. So if I drop down an if block, let's go ahead and say that if this condition is true, let's go ahead and remove point. All right, and we want to run this over all of our points. So let's plug the ptnum inside the ptnum for the remove point handle. Sometimes this errors out. So if I press Q to bypass and enable it again, this will now work. So if I now play around with our condition, so our compare value here, we can see we can start to delete points. We can't animate parameters inside this VOP context, so we will have to promote our second input. Let's middle mouse click, promote parameter, and I'll go up, and now we can animate this value here. So what I'll do, let's start with 0. I will add a keyframe, hold down Alt and left click. Let's go forward maybe 48 frames. I'll start to reveal all of my points. So I'll set this to 1, and then maybe up until frame 96, let's set this back to 0. So we are going to slowly fade our points in and then fade them out. And as a result, let's look at our particles. We can see that on our first frame, we are not having any particles. And if I press play, they're slowly going to start to appear over time. And then after frame 48, where we have all of our points, we are removing them again over time, and this will be the result. Okay, so this is very useful when you have maybe some sort of burst type of effects or anything really that requires your source to not be on all the time, but you don't want it to abruptly end like when we are using the impulse activation. So really all there is to note here is that you can affect how your source behaves in the SOP level, and it will translate over in the particle simulation, whether you remove or add points as well. And finally, we have one more emission type here, which we can look into, which is points. Now, I don't find myself using this option. What points will do is it's going to bring in only a certain amount of points. So if I go up, we have our scatter here at the SOP level, and we have roughly 2400 points. This points option will only bring a few of those randomly. So where all points brings in all of the points, points option here will just bring a few of the points, which is controlled with the birth tab. If I set this to a lower value and I reset and press play, we see we are sourcing in the points from the sub level, but we are really only grabbing a few of these. So if I set this to a higher value, we can bring in more points basically. So I don't usually find myself using this option, because if I just want to have less points, I would just control the scatter directly here at the SOP level. So I would just remove some of the points directly myself, and I would get more of an expected result. This points thing here is kind of hard to control. This points option is somewhere between all points and scatter onto surfaces. It's kind of a weird blend between the two. So usually I would either use all points or scatter onto surfaces and not this points option, but sometimes this might be useful. So this is what it will do. Now, particles can inherit any attribute from the source. So let's take a look at an example where this is useful. Let's maybe just start fresh, and we want to create something like a explosion burst type of effect. So let's start fresh, and I'll drop down a circle. Let's set this to ZX plane, and maybe I will make this smaller. Let's increase the subdivisions, and I'll decrease the uniform scale to maybe 0.25. And in this case, we can see that we don't have any points on our geometry inside the border. So this is again another good example why sometimes you have to scatter your own points. So let's drop down a scatter from here. Let's disable relax iterations, disable max point limit. And I will maybe want to decrease this. Let's maybe use 50 total point count. And from here, let's create a velocity attribute. So I will do this with an attribute VOP. Let's rename this to set V, and I'll step inside. Now, if I want a burst type of effect, I can create the velocities based on our origin. So let's say that we want the points to scatter from the 0, 0, 0 coordinate here, the center origin. All we have to do is simply subtract our points from this center point. So from my P, I will do a subtract. Let's promote this second input to a constant, and let's set this to a 3 float. If I plug this directly inside the velocity, let's go up and let's create a visualizer for this velocity. I'll just simply click on this V, and if I turn on my visualizer, let's take a look. This is how our velocities look. So we can think of this constant here as just a simple imaginary point that's right in the center of our scene. So if I were to grab the second value here and just drop this down, we can see now that we're kind of moving that imaginary point downwards, and now our points will point to the new position of our imaginary point. So we can very easily control our velocity this way. So I can just simply adjust this value however I want. Now from here again, it's best practice to normalize the vector. So after the subtract, let's do a normalize. So it's 1 unit length, no matter where we subtract the position from. And especially in the case for velocity, you will probably want to use normalized vectors. I usually like to affect the strength of the vector at the end. So after we do all of our operations here, I just add a multiplier right at the end so I can control the strength of the overall vector. Speaking of which, let's maybe just introduce some noise to this vector as well. So from the position, I will do a turbulent noise. Let's set this to a 3D noise. Let's set this to simplex, and I can just simply add this after the normalize. Let's plug this here, and let's go ahead and increase the frequency, maybe even the roughness in this case, and I can increase or decrease the amplitude to affect this randomness strength. Now, like I said earlier, let's go ahead. Let's say that this is the vector that I have. And now I would like to add a multiplier for strength at the end. So let's drop down a multiply node. Let's promote the second input to a parameter. So by the way, I'm just middle mouse clicking and choosing whatever operation we want to do here. And for the input 2, let's rename this. Let's set the label here to strength, and let's go up. And now I can simply, like I mentioned earlier, just control the strength of the vectors through this option here. Let's leave this at 1, and from here, and I'll turn off the visualizer. From here, if we plug this directly inside a pop net, we will instantly grab the velocities that we have. Let's maybe first we have to go inside, and in the pop source, let's set the emission type here to all points, because again we are scattering our own points, and maybe I'll set the display to points, and let's disable this guide option. So let's maybe go up at the sub level, and if I press play, let's see what we get. All right, so it's not great, but at least our vectors are moving, and now we can tackle each problem one by one. The first problem is that we are emitting again the same set of points for each frame. So this is also why we have this kind of trail effect, because our scatter is the same. So in our scatter mode, let's go to the global seed here, and I'll change this to a $FF expression. And now each frame again will have a different scatter. And while we are on this subject, on our V, let's turn back on our visualizer, it would also help if we randomize this noise pattern. So to do this, we can, let's go back inside, and for our noise, let's grab the frame and let's create a vector from this. So let's do float to vector, and from here we can simply plug this inside the offset, and now our noise will also have a different pattern. So this will help with our scatter, with our simulation. It will be a lot more chaotic and organic. So let's go up and let's disable visualizer and preview the new result. All right, so now it's starting to look like an actual kind of explosion effect. The second problem that we have is that I don't want to spawn points throughout the whole simulation. So we want to start removing points from our source over time. And I showed you earlier how we can do this. by deleting the points, but here, since we have access to the scatter node, I can simply control the amount of points we are scattering. So I can create a keyframe for the value of 50 at frame 1, and I can go forward, let's go maybe to frame 10, and I'll set a value here to 0. So now after frame 10, we are no longer spawning any particles, and we also have this nice smooth decay over time. So back in our popnet, this will be the result that we have now. All right, so now it's starting to look kind of like what we are looking for. And now, since we again are inheriting the velocity, I can go in the set V attribute and I can simply increase the strength. So this will be essentially the speed at which the particles are going. So if I set this to a strength of 5, now our particles are 5 times as fast. So it's very easy to control this way. And notice that we are creating all of these different kind of results by simply affecting our source. So we haven't set anything inside this DOB network at all. Everything was controlled at the SOP level through our sourcing. So this is why it's important that we know how to set up the sourcing. Now I can either affect the strength of our velocities here directly on our, let's maybe go directly on our source. So I can set the strength here, or I'll set this, let's just set this to 1. We can also affect the strength of the velocity inside. So if I step inside, if I go to the pop source in the attributes tab, we have, here is all of the inheriting options that we have. So first we can see that we do have initial velocity. This is set to use inherited velocity. So this is why we are picking up the velocities that we set. And we have this inherited velocity multiplier. So this is exactly like how we had our strength. If I increase this, this will now affect the speed of our particles. But usually I like to affect the strength at the SOP level. We also have a few more settings here for the inherit velocity. We can also add to inherit velocity. So if I set this to a value of 1, we can introduce our own variants over here. So this just adds randomness in the vectors. So if I press play, now they are a little bit more random. So if I increase this even more, we can see that we are adding more randomness on top of the vectors that we have. Again, I usually like to set whatever randomness I'm adding at the SOP level, but you also have this option here, and we can also give this an initial velocity. So if I set this to 0, so we are not inheriting any velocity, and let's set all of these to 0, we can also just give this an initial velocity ourselves. So if I set this to 1, 0, and 0, now our points will go in this direction that we set here. Again, I like to set it on the SOP level just so I have all the control that I want. So let's set this back to use inherited velocity, and let's just we'll set this at 1 and we'll just keep it at the default speed. We can also specify what attributes we want to inherit. So for example, if I don't want to carry over the color attribute from the sourcing, all I would have to do is use a caret symbol and then type the attribute that I don't want to carry over. So this caret symbol over here is what you can use to exclude something from a list. So in this case, we are excluding the color attribute, so the CD. If I didn't want, maybe there's a noise attribute, so if I don't want to inherit that, I would just use this symbol and type my attribute. All right, or I can just simply specify I'm not interested in any of the attributes. Let's just inherit the V attribute, so the velocity. So now from the whole attributes that we have on our source, only the V will get carried over. Let's reset this. Now I don't want to just push out particles and have them fly infinitely into space. Let's also make them fall. So for this we can introduce a gravity node, and this is where the forces nodes come in handy. So if I drop down a gravity force, I can plug this below the pop solver, and I don't know why we have to place this below our solver as opposed to what we usually do where we place nodes over here in this chain. Maybe this is a legacy thing, but whatever the case being, the gravity is kind of like a source, a force node that has this velocity applied to it. So this is the force that we are applying to our particles. So now if I press play, our particles are falling down. So maybe I can just go in the pop source and increase the velocity multiplier here. and this is what we get. All right, so now it's starting to look like an actual burst type of explosion. Usually in cases like this where we are trying to imitate kind of like real life, it's always worth adding a pop drag as well. So the gravity makes our particles fall down over time, and the pop drag will just simply slow down the particles over time. So let's leave the air resistance. Let's maybe set this to 0.5 and let's press play. So now they start off really fast with their initial speed that we set, and they slowly decrease their speed over time. So again, this adds more of a natural motion to our particles. Maybe this is too strong. Let's leave this. Let's just use 0.2 instead. So in this case, we do want to use some of the force nodes because we want to apply this slow, gradual change to our particles to get something that kind of mimics what would happen in real life. So this is again where the force nodes might come more in handy. And the reason these nodes that are based on force work in this case is because we are not constantly updating and overriding the velocity. So if I were to set the velocity inside this pop solver with a geometry VOP, let's go ahead and let's add the geometry VOP here, and let's say that I would want to create this velocity inside the DOP-net. I can just go up and I will disable the velocity over here, and I'll just simply grab this setup that we have. I'll grab all of these nodes. Let's hit Ctrl C so we can copy them, and we will just paste them inside this geometry VOP. Let's rename this to set V, and I will paste them over here, and we can see that automatically these are kind of linked already to the position. Let's check if this works. So I'll plug this in our V. Let's say that this is what we want to constantly update our velocity. And I'll remove this multiplier here, so it's just a unit length of 1. And let's see if this float here, this float to vector, this actually was connected to our time, and the other ones should be fine. All right, so if I go up, if I turn on the visualizer, we see again the node is disabled. We can actually just disconnect this from over here. So we are creating the same thing inside the DOP-net. And now the difference will be if I press play, we can see that we kind of have the forces affecting this, but the particles are not really affected by the drag, and they keep floating and going indefinitely into space. So we are not getting the same result at all. And this is because each frame we are overriding the velocity over here instead of inheriting it. So this is the nature of all simulations when we inherit velocity or where we set velocity directly. A velocity vector will get carried over from the previous frame, and when we apply drag, for example, let's say I have a timeline here which starts at frame 1, and then we have frame 2, 3, all right, and so on like this. Where we have a point that starts maybe on frame 3 with a certain velocity, that's maybe something like this. This will mean now that our point will be updated on frame 4. It will be maybe somewhere around this place, and we are going to carry over the velocity. But since we are applying the drag and other forces, the drag scales down the velocity. So this is how the drag works, the pop drag. So now our vector will be a little bit smaller than previously, and then on the next frame again it will be smaller and smaller until they completely stop. But when we are using a geometry VOP and we are updating our velocity each frame, we are no longer reading in this thing because again in our geometry VOP we are normalizing the vector, so we will always get one length unit vectors, and our vectors will have the same consistent scale throughout each frame of the simulation or each step of the simulation. So these force nodes will still affect our simulation, but again we are simply overriding the velocity and we are kind of canceling out their effect. So this might be a little bit confusing to get used to, but I hope this makes sense. All of this is to say that it's very important to be mindful when you want to update the velocity inside the solver or simply set it initially outside the solver like we are doing, like we did initially with our setup. All right, so let's keep this disconnected and let's step back inside. For cases like this, there's also a special attribute in the birth tab, or rather a group. This just born group will place our particles inside a special group that's only on the first frame in which they are born, and then on the next frames it gets removed from this special group. So if I set, we can give this any name we want. Let's just name this born. What happens with this group when our particle gets spawned on frame 3, for example, it gets placed in this group which exists only on frame 3. So the first frame when the particle is born. And so we can set whatever attributes we want when it's in this group. So for example, I can again illustrate this with the velocity. Let's maybe use a different color. So when I set the velocity and I run the geometry VOP only on this group, on the next frame when our particle is over here, it's no longer inside this group, and then the geometry VOP will no longer work, so it will simply inherit whatever velocity we set over here. So this will kind of mimic what we are doing when we are setting the velocities on the outside, so on our source. So each other frame after the particle is born, it's going to have the same velocity vector or whatever attribute we create for this just born group. So this is how this option works. And now, for example, in my geometry VOP, I can set the group over here. So I will name this born, all right, which again, all it does is essentially set this attribute once, just on the first frame, and then keep that attribute. So we are no longer overriding it. And as a result, now if I press play, we have the same thing that we had earlier. We can see our forces work as they should, and I can simply multiply this. Let's do a multiply constant on our velocity, set this to a value of 10. So now if I press play, we have again the same thing that we had earlier. Now sometimes this is useful to do with this just born group because you might not have the option to set certain attributes at the SOP level over here, like how we did initially. So this is where this just born group comes in handy. And we have a few more options here, which we will take a look in the next lesson. Now, to better explain what the jitter birth time and interpolate source do, let's set up another example. So I'll go up and we'll need an animated source to better explain this. So I'm just gonna go ahead and let's use test geometry Craig. And this comes with animation by default. So if I look at this, this is how the animation looks. Now let's try to spawn particles from the hammer, and I'll go forward in time, and really I'm interested in this portion of the animation where he swings the hammer and we have some speed. So all I'm gonna do here is let's go ahead and in this animation frame, let's set this to 100 or rather add 185. So this will essentially just offset our animation 185 frames forward. So at frame 1 we start off with this swinging animation. So from here, let's isolate the hammer. I'll press S and we can simply grab the hammer, and I'll press delete, and let's delete non-selected. Now the thing with Craig is that this comes as a packed geometry. So if I look at the information here or even here, we only have one point, and we also have this one packed geos that shows up here. So we will have to unpack this. Let's drop down and unpack. Now, packed geometry is a whole other subject by itself, which we'll cover more in the destruction course. But for now, all we need to know is that to access the geometry, so now if I press S and press 2, I can select any point that I want on this geometry, whereas where we have just the packed version, if I press S, we just have the one point, all right? So we have to access the geometry and we will have to unpack this. And as a side note, if you are importing an Alembic mesh from another software, you will probably need to use this unpacked node on that geometry as well. Anyway, now we can also get rid of this handle maybe, so I'll just press S, press 4 to go in primitive mode, and I will just double click the handle to select the entire geometry, and I'll press delete. So we are just left with this part of the hammer. And let's go ahead, and from here we can just plug this directly inside a popnet. And since the default behavior of the popnet is to scatter onto surfaces, we should now have what we are expecting. And maybe I'll go inside and let's go to the birth tab, add another 0 here, so we are just spawning more points. And we can also turn off guide geometry. So let's reset and let's press play, and this is what we have. So now for these options here, we will look at jitter birth time in a second, but basically this can be left at positive for maybe all of the cases. The more important setting here will be interpolate source. So notice this word interpolate. We can see that currently, especially in between the frames where the hammer is moving fast, we are simply placing points exactly where our hammer is on that current frame. So this is why we have this gap between our points. So when we set this option, let's try back over here and let's leave this interpolation method to topology. Now we can see if I reset the simulation, we no longer have this gap between the frames. So this will grab the points we have on the current frame where we are in the simulation, and it's going to randomly interpolate those points back to the previous frame. And usually you will want to interpolate the source backwards. So if let's maybe reset the simulation and let's step back inside. So when we are interpolating backwards, we are looking at the previous frame. And if I set this to forward, now we are looking one frame after. So we are interpolating to the next frame. And this isn't usually what you want. Usually you want to leave particles in the trails of an object, so in the object's wake, so to speak. So usually you will want to use back as an interpolate source option here. So again, what's happening here is where we have our hammer in one place, and let's say that the hammer is headed in this direction. Maybe on the next frame our hammer will be over here, so this is the hammer geometry. So our points usually just get scattered throughout a polygon surface like so. So we are just scattering in the same place, and what happens when we interpolate is it's going to look at this space, this gap between where our geometry is in a frame compared to the other frame, and it's simply going to fill the gap between those spaces, and it's going to randomly place our points to fill this gap. So this is what's happening here. Now this match topology only works if we have consistent topology from frame to frame, and there are cases when the topology changes over time. So for example, if I look at my geometry, we just have the same mesh throughout this entire animation, but let's say that I want to randomly delete parts of this mesh. So let's use a group expression node here, and I'll just use one of the presets. Let's use 30% chance, which means that we are going to grab 30% of the primitives. So this is going to create a group for us. Let's also randomize this selection per frame. So I will just add a seed inside this expression. Let's do plus at frame. So don't worry about this expression. All we are doing here really is selecting random primitives each frame. So now I can do a blast and I will select this group that we created, and this is the result that we have. So now our topology will no longer be the same on each frame. And if I go to the popnet and press play, we can kind of see some ugly gaps between our interpolation now as opposed to what we had earlier. So if I disable this and reset the simulation, we see we have this nice clean trails on our particles. So let's re-enable this blast node and reset the simulation. So in this case, it's better if we are using the velocity instead to interpolate our source, and this is where our second option comes into play. So use point velocity. Let's go back, and we will need velocity on our geometry source for this. And we want to add this velocity before we do our blast over here. So where we have our hammer, like so. Let's go ahead and let's do a trail stop from here, and we will compute velocity. So now if I check the point trail display, we have our velocity attribute, and this is carried throughout our blast node as well. And in our popnet, we have this option set to use point velocity. And by default, if I press play, because we are inheriting the velocity attribute, like I mentioned in the earlier example, we are pushing away the particle. So in this case, I can go to the attributes here and I can just set this inherit velocity to 0. So now we are just using the velocity to interpolate our points. Now we still have a little bit of gaps, and this is simply because we are removing, in fact, topology from our particles, but we can see that we have a better result than when we are using the match topology option in this case. So if I go up and reset, we can kind of see a little bit of a nastier result here because, again, we are removing topology, so it's not consistent from frame to frame. So this is where this use point velocity option comes in handy. Now, there's really a lot that goes into sourcing and interpolation and inheriting attributes. And I also have a separate video that goes more in depth about how to best handle interpolation and how to fix any particle stepping that you may encounter. So I will highly recommend checking that video out to get a better understanding on interpolating the source. Finally, let's talk about collisions, and we'll do another example for this. Let's start again with a circle, and let's set this to ZX plane, and let's also make this smaller, increase the divisions here, and let's start to scatter some points. Drop down a scatter, and again the same things that we did earlier. Let's go ahead and change the global seed, type the $FF expression here, and we'll keep this at 1000. All right, so we have a random seed per frame. Now we can use an attribute VOP to create some velocities like we did earlier, but there's a pre-built node that Houdini set up for us that does pretty much the same thing. So we can use a point velocity here, and let's set this initialization to set to a value, and we'll use 0, 1, and 0. So this creates the velocity vector. If I turn on the visualizer, here is the vector that we have. And we can give this any direction that we want. Let's just keep this straight up. And we also have a very handy curl noise tab option here. So if I turn this on, we can just use this to create our noise. I'll scale this down and also the swirl size and maybe increase the grain. So kind of the same thing that we did earlier, but we're just using a pre-built node to do all of this. And we can see that this is also animated by default because this animated option is turned on. So this is perfect. So again, all of this we can build ourselves in an attribute VOP, but sometimes when you want to work fast and brainstorm some ideas, I like to use these pre-built nodes just so I can work fast. But as a beginner, I would really encourage you to use VOPs as much as you can to get used to working with them. And when you're a little bit more advanced, then you can take the shortcuts and use some of these pre-built nodes. But it's important to note how to reach these results yourselves rather than relying on the nodes that Houdini set up for us. Anyway, from here we can do a transform node, and I will attach this to the point velocity. And now if I press enter, I can use the handle and I can move my source around. But if I rotate my points, you can see that the velocities rotate with them. So this is a very cool feature of the transform node. And I can even, if I press E to get my scale tool, I can even scale this, and now I can affect the strength of this vector. So I can make these particles go faster by just increasing the scale of this vector like so. Or I can do some really interesting things. So this transform node is very powerful. And this is happening because we see in the attributes tab over here, this is affecting all of our attributes. So this is what this star symbol is doing. It's applying this transform operation for all of our values. So for example, if I just wanted to affect our position, I can set this list here. I can just type P. So now we can see that even though we are rotating around our points, our velocities point in the same direction. So sometimes if you don't want to affect the other attributes, you can just specify that you just want the position. But I'll set this back to star so we can affect the attributes as well. And I don't want to affect the scale. Let's set this to 1, 1, and 1. But I will move this to the side. Let's reset these values. I just want to push this over to the side like so and just rotate this maybe 90 degrees horizontally like so. So the particles will push in this direction. So a lot of things you can do with this transform node. A lot of times I like to create my sources and attributes, or rather vectors, at the origin, so at the center of my scene, and then just simply move them around or use a copy to points if I want the vectors to follow a certain point or source over time. And there's a lot of tricks that you can do, but I just wanted to show you what you can get out of the transform node. So let's disable the visualizer. We'll spawn particles that go over to the side, and let's create a simple sphere in the center here. I'll just add this sphere and keep the default settings as they are. And from here, let's also add a null, and let's say that this will be our collision. So let's type here sphere collision, and let's create our pop net. So from my transform, for my sources, let's drop down a pop network. Let's step inside, and because we are scattering our own points, we'll set the emission to all points and disable guide. Let's press play, and we have our particles and everything is working as expected. Maybe this noise is a little bit too strong. Let's go back to the strength here and I'll scale this down. I just want to introduce a little bit of noise. All right, so we have our sphere at the SOP level. Let's go ahead and Control C on this null to copy this, and I will go inside. And the way we add collisions is with a static object. So let's drop down this static object from our list. So here it is, and we'll just simply point our stop path to our sphere. So I will paste the path to the sphere collision null over here. And now to add this in our chain, we have to add the collision objects after our solver. So whether this is a pop solver or vellum solver or any other kind of solver, we will have to add this after the solver, so the collisions. To add the collisions, we have to use a merge node, which is a little bit weird to be honest, but merge inside DOP network means collisions basically. So if I plug this over here, we see our sphere now showing, so it's part of our chain, but we will have to reverse the order here. So the default relationship is left input affects right inputs, so we have to go from left to right. With this merge node selected, I can press Shift R to reverse the order, or I can use this list here to drag my objects in the order that I want. So I usually prefer using Shift R to just reverse the order. So now the object is on the left, the collision object, and our particles are on the right. So this is what you usually want. And if I disable the visualizer and press play, we should have our collisions working already. So this is what we have. Let's maybe go up, and I'll go to my source and drag this over closer to my sphere, and maybe I'll make this sphere a little bit bigger like so. All right, so let's reset. And this is what we have. So we already have some behavior from our collisions. Let's step back inside and let's look at our static object. In the physical tab, we have some properties that we can play around with here. So bounce will push our particles back. If I set this to 0 and reset, we can see now that some particles get stuck in the center of our sphere, but some particles continue to slide across the sphere. So this is what this bounce forward will do. If this is 0 as well and I press play, then our particles are simply sticking to the sphere. With bounce forward and the regular bounce, if I set this to the default of 0.5, now, depending on the angle at which they hit the sphere, they will either bounce backwards or bounce forward. So if I were to go in Photoshop for a second, let's say that this is the sphere and we have a particles. Let's say that our source is over here for our particles. If the particle is moving like so and it's kind of perpendicular to the surface, this will make our particle bounce backwards and also preserving this angle. And when the particle is sort of on the tangent of the source of the surface, so let's say that maybe one of the particles goes something like this, so we have a bigger angle on our reflection, because this is basically what's what's happening, our particles will then be allowed to bounce forward like so. And we see that we have a really big angle for this reflection thing that's happening. Now, don't worry too much about this, just note that if it's hitting the surface perpendicularly, it will probably bounce back, and when it's hitting the surface at an angle, it will use the bounce forward option. So this is why if I set this bounce to 0 and I leave the bounce forward at 1, we can see some particles are traveling forward and some particles in the center here are stuck. These are the particles that would have gotten the bounce backwards. So when I set this to 0.5, this is how they are bouncing in the opposite side. And some of the particles that are hitting more the sphere at an angle, they will receive more of this bounce forward. And now friction is how sticky the particles are to the surface. Let's maybe set the bounce to 0 so we only have more of the bounce forward effect. The friction will determine how sticky they are to the surface. So if I set this to a high value, now they will pretty much completely stick to the surface. And if I set this to a low value, so if this is 0, then they will just completely slide off of the surface and they are being taken care of by this bounce forward now. So depending on what kind of behavior you want, you will need to adjust all of these parameters. And the dynamic friction scale, when the particle is already sliding, this will add a little bit of friction on that sliding motion of the particle. So as the particle slides more across the surface, it tends to get more sticky. So from what I understand, this is what the dynamic friction scale does. And temperature is something to do with fluid simulation, so you don't need to worry about this for now, but I kind of never use this either way, so don't worry about this setting. Now, all of these settings, usually you'll just have to play around with and experiment. Even if you know what they do, you'll probably need different settings depending on the effect that you're after. So usually you'll have to go back and forth with these values until you get the right behavior. Let's maybe just set the friction to 0.5 and we'll keep these settings as they are, should be okay. Let's go in the collisions tab and here we have a few important settings to look into. This collision detection is set to use solver default, and we can choose whether we want to use volume collisions or surface collisions. Now, generally, in most cases, I would recommend that you use volume collisions. Volume collisions are super fast and you can get pretty accurate results. And with volumes, when you turn a collision object into a volume, you don't have to worry about multiple layers of geometry. So for example, if I go up and if I drop the test geometry Tommy object and take a look at him, we have this character, and this mesh is made up of multiple meshes. So if I look at my shirt, I can delete this and we can see again that he's made up of multiple objects. So if we are using surface collisions, this can get a little bit messy, but when we turn this mesh into a volume, so if we do VDB from polygons and I decrease the voxel size here, everything is kind of packed together, so you don't have to worry about having multiple meshes. Everything is just combined into one mesh. So that's one of the reasons why this is powerful. And the other reason is that it's just simply faster to calculate than regular collisions. So again, I would just use volume collisions in maybe most cases. So when this is set to volume collisions, let's turn off display geometry and let's turn on the collision guide. This will automatically create a volume for us with this default mode of ray intersect. So here we can adjust the resolution. We can see that as I lower this, we have lower and lower resolution volume, and we can increase the uniform divisions to get a more accurate representation. But what I like to do here is create my own volume at the sub level and then use that volume inside the collision. So what I'll do is go up, and from my sphere, let's turn this into a signed distance field, so an SDF. So we know from intro to volumes what an SDF is and how to create it. So if you want to know more about volume, volumes, I really recommend taking that course as well. Let's do a VDB from polygons from here. And for SDF, we'll keep this at surface. And we will want to fill interior. So it's important that we have this option on when we want to do collisions. And now in the voxel size, we can just decrease this to increase the resolution. Maybe I'll give the sphere more topology as well. Let's set the primitive type to polygon and I'll just increase the frequency. So if I go back, we will use this volume as collision. So let's go back inside the PubNet and let's use for mode, let's use volume sample. And now in the proxy volume path over here, we will have to point this to our object. So let's go up and let's grab our sphere collision again, Control C, and let's paste the path here inside the proxy volume. And when we have this option turned on, we can in fact get rid of the saw path over here, so we don't really need this. We can see that as I remove this, we still have our volume showing. So now if I press play, we can see everything is happening. Now we can leave the saw path to point to our volume as well. So I'll just paste the sphere collision here, mainly because I want to turn off the collision guide and we want to display the geometry. So if I reset the simulation, we can see the geometry as well, and this is why we can use the saw path as well. But the collision will look at the proxy volume over here. So this is the important path that we need to specify. All right, so if I press play, we see the collision is working. And now if we were working with an animated object, let's go up and let's go to our sphere. Let's drop down a mountain node from here. All right, and let's also turn on animation for this. So if I look at the animation now, we have this moving geometry. So now our VDB will be recalculating each frame. And if I go in the PubNet, we will need to specify to use deforming geometry. So now this will force our static object to grab whatever we are having at the SOP level. So this will now update as well. So if I press play, we can see that everything works as it should. Now, the cool part about using an SDF is that, for example, some of the time you might want to smooth out the surfaces on which the particles are colliding. So after the VDB from polygons, I can also do a VDB smooth SDF. And this is kind of like a blur over the volume. As we can see, we can increase the iterations. So we can smooth out the surface a little bit, and this will enable our particles to slide a little bit easier. And maybe if we have points where our particles are sticking to the object, we can smooth out the surfaces again to ensure that they keep sliding or they have an easier time sliding. So this is sometimes useful, and we can also offset where we want the collisions to happen. So we can also use a VDB reshape SDF, and we can set this to either dilate or erode. So we can see that with this, if I template my sphere on top, let's template the result with the mountain. If I push this, I can kind of push this in a little bit if I don't have the most accurate collisions. And now if I look at my sphere and also look at the particles, this is the result that we will get. So maybe I want the volume in this case to be further out than our sphere geometry. So I will set this to dilate instead. So I'll push out the volume slightly. Let's look at our result now. Okay. And also we notice that when I look at the PubNet result, we are previewing the collision as well. And this is because by default inside this object merge, we are bringing in all the objects. So if I look inside the pop object, this means that we are bringing in the pop object, so our particles, and also our collision object as well. So if I want, I can just import the pop object. So I can go up and I can say that I only want to bring the pop object. So this will get rid of the collisions. And now I can preview the geometry before we turn it into a volume. And this is the result that we get. All right, so we can see that with a moving geometry, this is a little bit slower to simulate. And this is also because all of these settings that we are doing over here. So when we are turning the geometry into a volume and then running the smooth and then the reshape, these are slowing down our process overall. So if I look at my collision result, we can see that this collision object is running rather slow. We are just having maybe 7 FPS FPS over here. So what we can do to optimize things is we can actually cache this entire volume. So we can do a file cache, and let's just save out 100 frames, and I will save to disk. So now we are saving the entire sequence to disk and reading it from disk. And if I play the simulation now, we can see that we're running in real time, so 24 FPS. And now this will translate to our POPNet. So if I look at my simulation now, we can see that it's running actually in real time. So this is much faster. So it's always worth spending extra time optimizing your simulations however you can. And always remember that if your sources are slow, so if I were to preview my particle source, and if I were to play this and have a slow loading time or slow playback for the source, this will translate over to the simulation as well. So again, it's always important to be mindful of the sources for the particle source and the collision as well, and optimize things wherever you can. So like I said, we are going to talk more about collisions in the other courses as well, and this was a brief introduction to collisions, and hopefully you know enough to get started now. So we've reached the end of our course, and I really hope this was helpful. I will admit that some of the techniques and workflows that I've shown might be a little bit more advanced, not really suited for complete beginners, but like I mentioned, I don't really want you to waste time learning the shortcuts and the pre-built way that Houdini offers us. I would much rather you learn the proper workflow and the proper techniques from the beginning and sort of rewire your brain into working more with VOPs. So whether it's at the sub level or at the top level, I hope by now that you understand that it's really the better way of working, and it's what's going to allow you to not hit walls all the time and really progress the furthest in the long game. So this was pretty much it. Thank you for watching. If you want to see how I use particle simulations in real-world projects, you can check out my pro courses on voxsite.com. More courses are coming, so stay tuned.